So, King Charles made the call to pull Camilla from hosting the garden party. But here's the strangest thing about it. It's not even that he did it, it's that backup strategies had already been created in advance before she even realized her position was getting cut. Like music before the actual moment happened, before that private lunch where tensions boiled over, documents were already sitting in folders detailing precisely how to scale back her responsibilities. That tells you someone within those palace walls predicted this was coming. And frankly, the fact that those files existed before Camilla got word is perhaps more telling than the decision itself. Before we dive into how this spiraled so fast, if you're interested in more royal investigations like this, make sure you subscribe to Crown Watch. We uncover the details that live between the official announcements. Let's get started. Charles sat by himself at his desk, studying the hosting list as though it had grown heavier than the crown itself. His finger moved once, then froze. The garden party. This is the kind of royal gathering where the king invites select guests onto palace grounds to demonstrate music, public solidarity, and strength had been arranged as this grand statement of togetherness. Camilla was meant to stand right alongside him, beaming during the event, welcoming attendees, basically music demonstrating to observers that everything at the palace remained intact. And hosting goes beyond just shaking hands. It represents who holds power, who maintains prominence, who remains closest to the sovereign. That's precisely why the order of who greets which guests carries such importance. It becomes a visible record of hierarchy, and everyone observing understands how to interpret music. Charles shifted his gaze to her name. For a few moments, he remained silent. Then, he drew a line through it. He dismissed Camilla from garden party hosting responsibilities, music, and transferred the role to another prominent royal. And according to royal tradition, those guidelines that establish sequence, hierarchy, and ceremonial conduct, this adjustment held significantly greater value than simply shuffling the program. This wasn't a final-minute adjustment to the agenda. This was establishing a boundary. This was the king establishing that the occasion had to stay above discord, resentment, or personal agendas. Camilla got word in a quiet meeting room, and her demeanor shifted before her words did. She stayed composed, but it was a hurting kind of composure. When the aide finished, she posed just a single question. Was this his call? The aide spoke with caution, noting the adjustment was rooted in manner, perception, and management within the palace. Camilla grasped every implication. Manner referred to music, the overall feeling of the occasion. Perception indicated how the general public would interpret it. Management music indicated Charles no longer felt assured about the setup. The shut door transformed everything. Charles hadn't dismissed her to plug a vacancy. He had imposed a royal measure, and everyone positioned to witness the consequence recognized it. Yet this is where it becomes more complex. The real shock wasn't that Camilla had been let go. It was who Charles was attempting to shield through his choice. Since every royal move carries two interpretations, the one recorded in documents and the one lived in the expressions of those affected by it. For Charles, this was beyond a hosting adjustment. For Camilla, it was beyond simply losing a ceremonial position. For William, it signaled something ominous, and across the palace, everyone grasped that a single garden party had uncovered a far more extensive division. Charles recognized that silence could be riskier than shouting. He'd invested his whole existence becoming skilled at speaking with measured words when chaos was spreading, and that understanding now stood between him and the person sitting opposite him. The garden party appeared uncomplicated from outside, a beautiful royal occasion where chosen attendees encountered the family on palace property. But to the institution, it represented considerably music more. It was a public message regarding confidence, standing, and membership. Whoever held the spotlight music wasn't merely greeting attendees. They became a symbol of the establishment's vital core, and Camilla Music was completely aware of this significance. She'd regarded those hosting obligations as affirmation that the lengthy period of rejection, music, gossip, and underlying resistance ultimately had concluded. Holding that position next to Charles meant acknowledgement, approval, and safeguarding. Therefore, when he conveyed that arrangements had shifted, music the sting went much further than the language itself suggested. Charles stayed serene. He didn't make accusations. He communicated carefully, nearly tenderly, and that gentleness stung more than rage could have. Camilla remained immobile, her features blank. Music yet pain was evident in the moments between each breath. Charles attempted to convey that the music adjustment was aimed at safeguarding the occasion, safeguarding the attendees, and safeguarding the institution from a public exhibition of internal friction. Yet Camilla sensed a harsher meaning. She felt remoteness. She felt hesitation. She felt the sovereign prioritizing the establishment above her standing. And as William appeared later, composed and thoughtful, the atmosphere shifted once more. The music heir didn't endorse the adjustment. He didn't advocate for it further, yet he grasped what his father had already come to understand, that this removal could resolve one public concern, while music generating a far deeper interpersonal wound. William noticed the sealed palace memo before Camilla music did. The document indicated the hosting sequence had been examined repeatedly well before the formal schedule music was finalized. That implied the removal wasn't the result of sudden urgency. It had been debated, weighed, music approved. Camilla grasped then that during her confidence in the position's security, others had already voiced doubts in private discussions. Charles saw that understanding dawn on her, and the room appeared to tighten music around them. The decision had been finalized. The deterioration had begun. However, the central issue gnawing beneath every measured look was the reason Charles finally took action now, after permitting Camilla to hold his side for so long. And that explanation wasn't rooted in the garden party at all. It originated in a confidential gathering days prior that transformed hushed unrest into music royal repercussion. The institution recalls specific moments not due to volume, but since people never overlook what transpired afterward. Prior to the garden party announcement, a confidential lunch became the occurrence that everyone subsequently pointed to music as the catalyst. A remark was uttered. A Sikh moved loudly across the ground. One expression turned rigid, and at that second, Charles recognized the coming public engagement couldn't proceed as arranged. Charles attended that lunch, assuming the remaining particulars might still be settled diplomatically. The meeting had been organized in the palace dining area to confirm the greeting sequence music for the garden party, and every person in attendance comprehended what that sequence signified. Guest greeting denoted the predetermined flow of which palace member would greet which assembly, initially spanning dignitaries to non-profit groups to armed forces members. It appears uncomplicated. It's anything but. Within palace customs, order becomes significance, and significance becomes influence. Charles understood that poor positioning might convert a cordial gathering into a wordless proclamation of who held prominence. Camilla recognized Catherine's role before any clarification was given. For one portion of the event, Catherine had been positioned higher than her in the greeting sequence, and that adjustment struck the room like a signal. Camilla didn't instantly respond with anger. She objected with a calm intensity that made the environment more uncomfortable than fury would have created. Charles noticed her language turn more pointed, and the old unease surfaced. Not apprehension of public criticism alone, but apprehension that hidden friction was demanding the public arena. William articulated his perspective carefully, merely quietly, requesting that the sequence remain as scheduled for the event's integrity. The heir grasped that Catherine's place wasn't a slight toward Camilla. It represented stability, a method to display what lies ahead before multitudes could dissect every movement. Camilla interpreted it distinctly. She sensed being pushed aside. She sensed a newer generation advancing while she faced pressure to settle for less. Then she positioned her cup back with sufficient intensity that voices stopped cold. No one was required to speak the divide. Everyone could feel it. Charles exchanged looks between Camilla and William, and the hush turned agonizing. Then she released the comment that shifted everything. Then perhaps everyone should music understand who was genuinely leading this household. The comment wasn't yelled, yet it possessed the hazard of a spark close to combustible material. Charles grasped immediately that the garden party risked becoming more than ceremonial. It might turn into a masked dispute. Charles finished the lunch without fanfare, yet the rift had seeped into the structure. When the group dispersed, he instructed the aide to go music out and remained solitary with a hosting document for nearly 10 minutes. Once he summoned his personal secretary back, his option had solidified. That lunch transformed into the moment beyond which he couldn't retreat. Yet the genuine confrontation transpired when Camilla discovered Charles had reacted to her words. And when the door swung shut behind them, king and consort moved past discussing a garden event. They were facing the boundaries of authority. There are statements a king may broadcast music, and statements a spouse struggles to voice when alone. Charles had devoted his existence to perfecting composure, but inside that space, music composure transformed into a weapon. Camilla arrived seeking reassurance. What she encountered instead was a determination already locked in, documentation already finalized, and a man unwilling to bend from the most brutal truth of the conversation. Charles didn't stand as Camilla came through the door. That simple act conveyed everything no statement could. He maintained his position at the desk, appearing fatigued in a manner no scepter could conceal, with the updated garden event hosting arrangement sitting between them as testimony. A royal chamber isn't merely a confidential workspace. It's the sort of environment where sovereign choices crystallize prior to becoming known to the world, and this determination had crossed that boundary. Her function had been rearranged. The sequence had received authorization. The occasion that previously was meant to cement her standing had transformed into the arena of her displacement. Camilla stood motionless briefly, declining to acknowledge the weight of the document in front of her. Then bitterness overtook her. She demanded whether this constituted retribution, whether a single harsh comment during a lunch gathering was adequate rationale to expunge her from the highlight of a royal gathering. Charles regarded her bearing the weariness of someone recognizing each statement would inflict damage. He conveyed he wasn't enacting vengeance. He was shielding the royal establishment from transforming into a family dispute played out before audiences. The language was temperate, music, yet it struck forcefully because Camilla grasped what it signified. He recognized the hazard was genuine. Camilla's bitterness fractured. It gave way to melancholy, hushed, and profound. She had anticipated comfort, perhaps even contrition. However, Charles wasn't soliciting her perspective. He was communicating her circumstances. The hosting structure, the formal plan determining which palace members greet, which attendees, and through what sequence had currently undergone revision. And that's significance because royal sequence means far more than arrangement. It broadcasts to the world who commands respect, who commands sway, music, and who must yield when the establishment requires it. Charles ultimately disclosed the apprehension that had motivated him further than Camilla had imagined. Multiple prominent officials had advised him the garden event risked becoming an overt power exhibition if the preceding structure persisted unaltered. They were anxious that friction would penetrate the pleasantries, that visitors would perceive fragmentation, that media would capture what the establishment intended to conceal. Camilla absorbed this, aching not simply from the determination, but from recognizing that people had evaluated her standing before she possessed occasion to dispute it. Subsequently, Camilla voiced the concern. Both were circumventing. Had William been a factor in his conclusion? Charles faltered. He withheld an unambiguous response. He didn't supply the solace she desired. The quiet extended sufficiently to transform itself into an unspoken admission, and in that quiet, Camilla comprehended the determination, transcended a singular event, transcended a solitary hurt sensation, transcended even Charles's objection. Beneath existed a more fundamental matter regarding who genuinely orchestrates palace representation. Authority within the establishment seldom speaks loudly. It functions through timelines, arrangement orders, greeting processions, and designations positioned higher or reduced on documentation. From the external perspective, welcoming visitors to a garden gathering might seem dignified and uncomplicated, but inside palace grounds, the sequence of reception reveals authority, confidence, and signals. And now, the documentation sequence revealed something Camilla hadn't foreseen. Charles understood the determination wouldn't remain confined to paperwork. Once his endorsement appeared on the binding decision, the shift transcended a confidential inclination. It grew into sovereign decree. The garden event hosting arrangement was conveyed through palace assistants, music administrative personnel, protection specialists, and the king's concluding permission. Those positions carry significance because a palace gathering doesn't function on appeal by itself. Every greeting arrangement, every arrival schedule, every delegated responsibility communicates something. Camilla had imagined that message sustained her in a prominent location. The refreshed sequence communicated otherwise. Charles examined the documentation with a stillness that created disturbance in the seasoned representative beside him. The representative had experienced sufficient time to comprehend when stillness signals suffering, and he perceived the sovereign's fingers diminish when crossing Camilla's designation before the marking tool progressed. The hesitation carried weight. It signified this wasn't an uncaring determination. It was a taxing determination. Charles wasn't merely rearranging his arrangements, he was prioritizing the establishment's outward presentation above the well-being of his household, and that resolution furnished the documentation with its music significance. Garden event hosting existed as section of the establishment's ceremonial arrangement. the scheduled progression through which the sovereign institution conveys coherence, position, and confidence to the spectators. William recognized that choreography with penetrating comprehension. During a subdued meeting, the heir communicated to an assistant with composed restraint, emphasizing music they had to stay composed, not splintered. He wasn't pursuing acknowledgement. He pursued steadiness. He comprehended Camilla's diminished music placement would be scrutinized by anyone conversant with palace communication, and he additionally grasped a solitary misstep. Music might transform propriety into degradation. Yet the prospective sovereign didn't move beyond the actuality. The occasion had to advance the establishment prior to advancing personal honor. Camilla's displacement penetrated deeper than the preliminary notification implied. The refreshed greeting sequence restricted which audiences she may ceremonially greet, minimizing her ceremonial presence and restricting the position where she could operate as a prominent participant. Subsequently, an extra memo music surfaced inside the preparation documentation. It delineated contingency scenarios, organized beforehand, confirming the palace music had prepared for objection previously. Camilla ever opposed the determination. I need to emphasize that for a moment, since that information is genuinely astounding. They didn't simply reply to the gathering. They possessed contingency strategies positioned in a portfolio music prepared in advance, prior to she even grasped a circumstance persisted. That's not reactive problem-solving, that's calculated reassignment. Charles examined the complete structure music and grasped the peril. Documentation could direct personnel. They could substitute music identities. They could order activity, yet they couldn't manage resentment. Upon the notification spreading through the chambers, between assistants, between interactions, from articulated to unspoken, as the refreshed directives made their course to the household coordinators, the building was no longer organizing an occasion. It was organizing consequences. The preliminary indication of fracture wasn't a broadcast statement. It was an entrance sealed. Camilla returned to her quarters with her expressions collected. However, those observing recognized the transformation immediately. The individual prepared to welcome attendees underneath palace plants was unexpectedly instructed to withdraw, and in royal circumstances, stepping back can appear more excruciating than dismissal. Camilla departed from Charles with the variety of restraint that simply accentuated the damage. She didn't object inside the passageway. She didn't petition for further conversation. She just moved into the neighboring chamber music and enabled the quiet to subsume what restraint refused to express. The refreshed greeting documentation had already started propagating via the establishment, altering arrival schedules, reception locations, and the obligations given to prominent relatives. Those directives carried consequences since a garden occasion is never purely an enjoyable gathering. It's a documented hierarchy of music standing, and Camilla had recently been relocated distant from the highlight of that hierarchy. Administrative personnel got the communication with composed expressions and diminished tones. They received instructions to acknowledge the modification as completed, not temporary, and to refrain from discussing it outside of standard guidelines. Guidelines indicate the stringent procedures that preserve music royal activities regulated starting with positioning to who speaks initially. Yet customs couldn't diminish the conversation. Camilla's function hadn't been postponed, it had been scaled down. The establishment wasn't permitting negotiating room, and that by itself conveyed to every assistant that Charles had transgressed a line of emotion he couldn't simply retrace. Camilla remained in isolation following her departure, gradually taking off her hand coverings and arranging them on a nearby surface as though acknowledging the indignity stage by stage. The royal partner had made it through decades of criticism, yet this registered as distinct. This originated from internal sources. This came from the individual whose acceptance had once sheltered her from the harshest facets of palace existence. Her melancholy didn't manifest violently. It moved in gradually since she recognized that ceremonial composure regularly demands concealed suffering. Charles remained in his chamber after their exchange, keeping his gaze on the shut entrance well after she had vanished. The sovereign found himself torn between household connection and establishment authority, and neither path supplied solace. He had safeguarded the occasion, yet damaged the human he cherished most. Subsequently, the following discovery intensified the establishment's atmosphere. Representatives discovered that Camilla's designation had additionally been removed from a condensed working memo prepared for garden event photographers and visitor facilitators, the assistants responsible for directing attendees and managing the sequence of the occasion. Charles grasped the implication. The establishment didn't merely want her function minimized, it wanted absolute certainty regarding who would noticeably head the gathering. Still, the private consequence of the determination didn't arrive until Charles and William conversed independently, absent from consultants, functions, or watching eyes. What occurred afterward wasn't a dialogue between sovereign and heir. It was an intimate understanding between elder and younger. When Charles and William ultimately stood in isolation, the establishment apparatus faded. Zero assistance, zero constructed statements, zero formal audience to the actuality, merely a parent who had performed an agonizing determination and a child who recognized it had grown inescapable. Inside that isolated chamber, the garden occasion halted being the focal point. The genuine concern was the trajectory of the establishment by itself. Charles invited William to come in after the modified greeting sequence had finished, and that message transported a gravity each comprehended. This wasn't simply another formal communication. A greeting sequence means the sanctioned structure determining which palace person would greet which attendees, and through which location throughout an open establishment gathering. Yet, for Charles, the documentation had grown substantially more intimate. Music had demanded he make a choice between the calmness of his partnership and the external steadiness of the establishment. William came in with restraint, not as an opposition, yet as a child acquainted with what his parent had simply sacrificed. Charles didn't disguise the determination. Had been music uncomplicated. He recognized he had allowed tension to persist excessively, permitted quiet to sustain what indignation had currently tensioned. The sovereign comprehended Camilla would experience soreness, and that mattered since her participation beside him had consistently transcended ceremonial duty. It had functioned as validation of endurance, validation that spans of skepticism had ultimately transformed into authorization. Displacing her from the highlight of the garden occasion didn't simply rearrange the calendar, it assaulted the interpretations she had built surrounding that job. William absorbed this with restrained consideration. The heir didn't seem music contented. He didn't view Camilla's removal as accomplishment. Rather, he communicated with the composed authority of an individual who had monitored the strain accumulate through extended spans. Adjustment, he communicated to Charles, experienced this harsh, solely because the quiet had endured excessively prolonged. The statements struck with pressure, yet they maintained no malice. They held veracity. William grasped that external duty occasionally necessitated a concealed injury, yet he additionally recognized damages within a palace family seldom endured concealment indefinitely. Charles subsequently unveiled the apprehension that had influenced him. He suspected the garden occasion might materialize as an obvious demonstration of opposing sway. Should he permit the preceding structure to endure, music attendees might perceive, helpers might detect it, the establishment might grin, yet the division would pulse underneath every interaction. William assured him he wouldn't manipulate the determination music since the establishment couldn't endure if interior triumphs transformed into exterior recognition. Charles regarded his child and perceived not victory, yet discipline. That redirected the emotional bearing of the incident. Yet, beyond establishment perimeters, the quiet was currently disintegrating, and civilization was organizing its personal appraisal. And whenever the account surfaced among the general public, a solitary visual articulated the significance of the determination with greater sharpness than any formal declaration music might. By daybreak, the establishment no longer controlled the account. The general public did. What commenced as a confidential arrangement determination grew into a community sensation, stripped of tender wording and positioned underneath merciless bulletins. Individuals didn't purely investigate the reasoning for Camilla's elimination. They inspected all imagery, all missing moments, music all shifted positioning, and single opening narrative shifted establishment, quiet into community assessment. Charles sought influence, yet sway evaporated the second the primary program launched with his determination. The establishment communication was succinct, measured, and detached, categorizing the garden occasion preparations as manifestation of the sovereign's preferences and the formal necessities of the occasion. That language transported significance since formal necessities symbolizes the public-facing obligations that sustain palace occasions structured, venerable, and devoted to the establishment's picture. Still, the assertion didn't reduce the uproar. It magnified it. Audiences grasped that whenever the establishment uses measured language, it regularly signifies something considerably more disorderly transpired interior. Camilla absorbed the broadcasts from an isolated chamber, and every announcement seemed to dislocate her repeatedly. Music? The display portrayed previous instances where she had functioned ceremonially with poise, positioned adjacent to Charles, as when her position had permanently grown undisputed. Subsequently, the narrative shifted toward the current structure, and the evaluation was unrelenting. Camilla averted her attention before the piece closed. She had weathered exterior appraisal previously, yet this registered as separate. This wasn't criticism originating externally. This constituted the establishment by itself, music shifting her placement, subsequently requesting her to bear the meaning in isolation. Charles examined one additional broadcast account with no response. His countenance firmed music whenever commentators outlined the determination as an atypical, obvious modification internal to the palace family, centering on his management music and Camilla's unexpected departure from the ceremonial position. He understood the actuality was considerably more excruciating than the descriptions permitted. Music had responded to prevent exterior mortification, yet the effort to stop a single fracture had exposed another. The sovereign music had defended the occasion, yet he had unveiled the division, subsequently materialized the visual that solidified the community response. A prominent publication music displayed a broad establishment garden picture displaying an unoccupied assigned position beside Charles, underneath the caption, "The sovereign sits alone." The statement struck like appraisal, distant from palace entrances. A congregation assembled, not boisterous, not disordered, yet observant. Observers referenced the publication headline, music speaking in hushed conversations regarding what Camilla's non-appearance signified, and whether this symbolized an adjustment, a signal, music, or silent decline in standing. Charles grasped that communications couldn't elucidate the whole actuality. Camilla understood. They might still music create pain. Civilization's perspective couldn't ascertain the ultimate interpretation of the circumstance. That determination belonged to what music he executed, what she surrendered, and what the establishment obtained. Once the tumult subsided, the ultimate appraisal didn't originate from printed language. It came from the private expense borne within establishment perimeters. In the music conclusion, this transcended merely an occasion among plants. It concerned the instant King Charles confirmed that connection, dedication, and establishment accountability don't perpetually progress concurrently. Camilla surrendered a position she assumed demonstrated her belonging. Charles surrendered the convenience of circumventing confrontation. William perceived the establishment opt for order, and the monarchy exposed what it safeguards initially. Charles moved through the occasion with a composed exterior and an anguished spirit. He grasped each acknowledgement would undergo observation, each hesitation inspected, each vacancy contrasted against the account, currently increasing exterior the perimeters. The garden occasion advanced via the modified greeting sequence, the sanctioned structure, determining which palace individual receives attendees, and positioning for each party throughout the event. That structure bore significance since palace circumstances communicate via placement. Camilla presided over the ceremonial reception, and the sovereign transported that determination in visibility. Grin following grin, recognizing the interior, suffering hadn't subsided. Camilla maintained composure, yet composure didn't undo the damage. She grasped now that her displacement wasn't a momentary mortification or a brief modification. It described a limitation, established by Charles individually. The establishment portrayed steadiness externally, yet the refreshed structure created the communication inescapable. Establishment requirement had surpassed individual desire. For Camilla, that comprehension carried more weight than any printed headline. She had imagined closeness to authority, guaranteed shelter. Rather, she discovered that adjacent to control didn't resemble guiding it. Charles didn't displace her to defile her. That constituted the concluding private comprehension, and it dug deeper since it possessed no malevolence. He displaced her since enabling the friction to endure might have diminished the establishment externally. The establishment, symbolizing the mechanism of sovereign control that persists independent of anybody, requested arrangement prior to contentment. Charles had sidestepped confrontation throughout the extent he possessed capacity, yet the garden occasion compelled him to decide. He selected the establishment. He prioritized the standing of the establishment beyond the calmness of his domestic situation. William's composed participation rendered the progression undetectable to overlook. The successor didn't demand acknowledgement, and he didn't hunger for admiration. His restraint communicated what existence would need: steadiness, control, and resistance to enabling concealed dispute to impact external obligation. William noticed the establishment might persist throughout suffering, yet not bewilderment. Charles perceived it similarly. Even while the sacrifice landed heavily separating him and Camilla, the conclusion bore clarity. Charles selected requirement beyond ease. Camilla discovered that conformity doesn't correspond to dominion. William monitored the establishment secure itself, utilizing painful accuracy. The establishment endured the instant by exchanging ease for arrangement. The garden occasion completed, the perimeter secured, and the conclusion persisted unambiguous. The establishment music had communicated, and even individuals positioned nearest it bore obligation to obey.